You guys are what I would call the normal people. On daylight savings, you came to second service. That seems super normal to me. I told all of first service how weird they were because they came on daylight savings to first service. I don't like daylight savings. This is kind of terrible. I think this is one of the first years that I've had to teach on the Sunday of daylight savings. I usually pawn it off to people like Luke and stuff, but this is the first year that I've had to do it. I was in Los Angeles all last week, and so my body got adjusted to Pacific Standard Time. And then I got home and we had daylight savings. And so now I'm 3 hours behind on my sleep. I wanted to share with you a couple weeks ago, or last week actually, I think I shared that we had received the funds for the roof in Cienega de Oro. And this week I received a picture. I think this is total last minute. Just want to show you guys that they're already getting started on the roof. For those of you visiting with us, we partner with some churches in the Cienega de Oro region of Colombia, as well as in the Amazon region. And so this was something that was a part of our Make a Difference offering in December. And we had raised half of the funds to get the roof started. And then just a couple weeks ago, God just stirred on the church to do the rest. And so they're already getting started in that process. Well, we're in a series in 1 Corinthians where we have Paul, who's writing this letter to this church that he's planted. He planted this church, and the church was doing really well, but it just kind of was getting off the rails a little bit. It was just kind of listening to worldly wisdom instead of godly wisdom, and it was kind of living the people were living their life out of the flesh and out of however they wanted to live it. And so Paul writes this letter. He's calm, he's collected, but he's also challenging them in the sense that they are living their life in such a way that they need to get things back on track. He's not questioning their salvation, but he is questioning what it is that they're doing with their salvation. And so he's asking them to seek the wisdom of God and not be enticed by the wisdom of the world. And Paul's now bringing this discussion of wisdom and folly and spiritual maturity and immaturity right down to where the Corinthians themselves are. You have this group of people who had been often listening to the philosophers of their day. They would go down to these city squares and they would listen to philosophers give all of this, like pontificate about wisdom and all of this. And Paul is saying, listen, you guys think that you have wisdom, you think that you're smart, you think that you have all of this knowledge, but I want to speak to that. And you have to imagine that I think about, I try to put myself in the context of scriptures as best as I can in circumstances. And I was thinking about the first 3 chapters of this book and how Paul is addressing the divisions in the church. He's recognizing that there are people who are following him, there are people who are following Apollos, there are people who are following Cephas or Peter, and so they're following all of these other humans, and in the first couple of chapters, Paul just continues to point these people back to Jesus, back to the cross. He says, I don't want you to forget that the whole reason we exist, everything that we're about is because Christ and Him crucified and what Jesus did on the cross, that brought salvation. That is our salvation and that alone. And he has this strong conviction that he's telling these people because he wants to remind them, I can't save you. Apollos can't save you. Peter can't save you. Christ and Christ alone can save you. And so if you're thinking about these people, they're listening to this message, they're like, okay, I understand now. Yes, Paul, we understand that Jesus and Jesus alone saves us. And you're kind of hoping as a member of the church, you're kind of hoping that he's forgotten about the fact that there's division there. He hasn't. Whoever's reading the letter, the leader in the church that's reading this letter to the people, you have to imagine that the people are like, okay, let's move on the division part, from the division part. But here comes another chapter where Paul is addressing the immaturity of the people because of their division and because of who they think that they are following. And so we're going to jump right in to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1 through 4. We're going to be through, I think, the first 16 verses of it, but we'll get there in just a moment. Brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I don't know how you feel about that first line, but if I'm sitting there listening to someone read this letter from Paul, and it says, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, I'd be like, whoa. Like, what? Like, Paul, we've been Christians for a while now. And he says, but as people who are still worldly, you're still continuing to live as the world lives. You're like infants in Christ. He says, I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Indeed, you're still not ready. Like when I came and I planted the church and I started to disciple you, I had to feed you milk because you weren't ready for solid foods. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? And they're like, oh, here he goes again. Here he goes again. He's bringing up the Apollos and the Paul thing again. And now he's saying that we don't even live by the Spirit, by the truth of God. And man, he's coming down hard on us. And Paul is addressing the church in such a way that he's saying, listen, you guys, you need to grow up. Now, most people I know don't really like conflict. I think that there's an unhealthy person who loves conflict, right? I mean, most people, if they're being honest, would say, I'm not super excited about any time someone wants to have conflict with me or any time I have to have conflict with other people. Most people avoid conflict, which often gets them in trouble, but people who love conflict, thrive off of conflict, and are excited about conflict, those people need Jesus. And I get it. There's personalities and different personalities that enjoy conflict or whatever, but I wonder, I'm not sure that's really our approach as Christ followers. If we have conflict, if we experience conflict, I think our role as Christians, we're to take a step back and to ask the question, what is my place in this conflict? What have I contributed to this situation or circumstance or experience that this person is bringing up to me? The Bible talks about it. The Bible in the New Testament it gives us perfect illustration of what we are to do in the midst of conflict or what we are to do when we are offended by someone or we're trying to correct someone. The Bible gives this illustration of someone who has a log sticking out of their eye while they're trying to get the little speck out of their brother's eye. And it's this beautiful picture of exactly what oftentimes we find ourselves in, where we go and we see something that is offensive to us or something that is hurtful, and we go and we try to just, oh, excuse me, you just got this, let me just, this wind probably blew something into your eye, and let me just get that out. All the while you're hitting them in the head with your log. Right? That's sticking out of your eye. You've just got this massive board. I've seen pastors use an illustration of like a 2x4 where they bring a 2x4 on stage and they hold the 2x4 up to their eye. And just to give this visual picture of how absurd it is that we're trying to correct other people while we ourselves actually have things that we need to address and deal with. And so in James chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" There's this picture of if there's fights and quarrels going on among other believers, it's probably because there's something going on in you that's at battle within you and something that you have to address yourself. Now, I grew up going to the Douglas County Fair. Anybody grow up going to a county fair before? Just like three of us. I grew up in a town called Roseburg, Oregon. It's about 20,000 people. We were the biggest city in the region, and so we were the county seat, and we had what was called the Douglas County Fair. And it happened, I think it was always in August, but definitely in the summertime. And one of my favorite parts about going to the fair is the rides, right? As I look back on my childhood, I'm trying to figure out the wisdom of my parents letting me ride these rides, because I think about all of the people that were in charge of putting these rides together. And I mean, they come in on a flatbed on a semi truck. I mean, that can't be safe. And we would ride things like the Gravitron. Any of you ever ride the Gravitron, where you get in the spaceship and it just spins you until somebody throws up? And then they clear the ride and they wash it out and they do it all over again. One of my favorite rides was the Fun House. Again, there's some creepy guy taking your tickets to get on the Fun House, and at some point in the Fun House there would be these mirrors. And you would look at yourself in the mirror, but it was like a distorted picture of yourself. It was like a Fun House mirror where your head was like this big and your shoulders are like this small. It's just this weird image, this distorted image. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about kind of our self-perception. Like there's self-awareness and there's self-perception. And sometimes if we're not in a great space, our self-perception can be distorted. It could be like looking at a mirror, in a funhouse mirror, and it's a reflection of us, but it's a distorted reflection. It's not exactly the truth of who we are. And sometimes we need people to come alongside us and help us with a clear picture of who we are. In the case of the Corinthian church, they had a distorted self-perception of who they were, and they needed Paul to come alongside and hold up a real mirror and to show them exactly who they were. And so Paul does that. Paul is essentially holding up this mirror to the believers in this church, and he's telling them what's going on, and he says, when you look at yourself, you are not spiritual people. You're not living a life of truth. You don't fully understand the truth of God. And he says to them, I have to refer to you as people of the flesh because you are operating out of the carnal, sinful nature that exists inside you. He says to them, y'all have put your faith in Jesus, and I don't know if Paul would say y'all, but he would say, you have put your faith in Jesus. You are Christians, but he's saying to them, friends, you are baby Christians. The thing about babies is they're cute. Kelly and I were talking about this last week, not because we're having one, but we would like grandkids at some point. Anytime soon would be fine. But we were talking about the difference between raising babies and raising teenagers. And we were just kind of going back and forth between the two, and we realized that they're pretty much the same. And I don't mean any disrespect to teenagers or anything, because I don't think it's healthy to badmouth generations and stuff. But we were just thinking about the fact that when you're raising a baby, you are You are its sole provider. You are taking care of it. It's waking you up at night for feedings. You're having to feed it all the time, and it's dependent upon you. And they were like, you would think it would get easier as they get older, but as teenagers, now you're waking up at night because you're thinking about everything that's going on in their life. You're concerned about them. You care about them, and so you're losing sleep over it. They're still dependent upon you for food. They're still dependent upon you for money. And the only difference that we could come up with is one looks at you with cuddling eyes, and the other one talks back to you. But nonetheless, a baby, as cute and cuddly as it is, like we love babies. If we saw a 6-year-old who acted like a baby, that would be annoying. We wouldn't like it. If we were out and about and we saw a 6-year-old drinking from a baby bottle, wouldn't that be like, whoa, something's not right here? If we saw a 6-year-old, and we've actually seen this, walking around with a pacifier in their mouth, we'd be like, that's not right. Something's not right there. And what Paul is saying to this church is, you guys are older now. You're still walking around drinking from a bottle. You're still walking around with a pacifier in your mouth. Well, Paul's not saying, what's the matter with you? Because that would be rude. But I'm saying, Paul would say, what's the matter with you? Like, what's going on here? There's a disconnect. And essentially, Paul is saying about these believers, he's like, you all are still acting like infants, like babies. And so Paul gives them kind of this mark of maturity, and he uses this illustration, number one, of diet. He's like, you still have to drink milk instead of enjoying a nice ribeye steak, medium rare. Right? If it's anything over medium rare, you need Jesus. But, can I get an amen this morning? It's pretty bad when the only time I say, can I get an amen, is about our steak. But, it's just Texas. So, Paul's saying, listen, you can only comprehend the elementary basics. Like, you're only drinking milk, and I would love to give you more, but you're just not ready for it yet. I mean, even a baby, like if you were to cut up a ribeye, no matter how small you cut the pieces, you put it in front of a baby in a high chair, they're not going to be able to eat it. Wouldn't be good for them. They choke on it. They can't chew it up. And that's what Paul is saying about these people in the church. See, the more I dive into the gospel, the more I understand how the gospel will radically transform all of the parts of my life. It's not just that the gospel saves my soul. It does. But how his gospel message and what his gospel message teaches me about sacrificial living. What his gospel message teaches me about my marriage and how I sacrifice in my marriage and submit in my marriage and love in my marriage, and how I lead my family, how the gospel message moves us beyond just he saves us. And it is a salvation gospel. And that is the foundation for sure. But what Paul is addressing is the growth. He's saying, but you haven't matured. See, what the gospel message teaches me about forgiveness, about grace. See, these are the more difficult topics that as we mature and we dive deeper and deeper into the gospel message, we should be able to digest. We should be able to learn and grow in. These people have an elementary understanding of faith in Jesus, and they don't understand the depths of his gospel yet. So Paul's calling them out. In fact, he's saying, you guys are immature. And I was thinking about like, how am I going to teach on this without coming across condescending to our church? Because just last week, I think I said that this book of 1 Corinthians is this letter that was written to them could be written to us today. And you could be sitting here thinking, is he calling us immature? Is he saying that we're like babies and we need to grow up? I mean, I'm not, but Paul might be. No, I'm just kidding. I find myself in a place where as I look at this, I continue to hold up the mirror and say, what is my role in this? See, Paul is saying, you have jealousy. You have strife in the church. And he's saying that jealousy and strife are these marks of immaturity, and love and peacefulness are marks of maturity. And so as I was thinking about the timing of this message, I was thinking about us going into, we are in an election season. We are in a time where it would be easy for us to have disunity within the church or go into circumstances and situations where we're having strife and we're fighting or we're upset and all of these things. And Paul would say, well, that would be immature. It would say maturity is when you have love, when you have peace, when you care about people. And so he gives them this mark of maturity, of love and peacefulness. And he says we can't say we love God. We can't say we are saved by grace through faith and have a foundation of our lives, the salvation of our soul, and then turn around and treat people poorly. So the question for us is, how do we handle the divisions in our life? What are the circumstances and situations where we are divided with those who are close to us, those we love, those we care about? How are we handling those divisions? And how do we handle people who cause us strife? Because if you're like me, there's a lot of people that can cause strife in your life. There's a lot of people who will respond to you in a negative way or try to egg you on to get you to respond in a negative way. And so how are we going to respond? How will we respond to divisions? How will we respond to those people who cause us strife? Because Paul would say we are only as mature as our understanding and application of the gospel. See, it's not enough to just understand that we are saved by the cross. We are saved by Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Yes, that is our salvation. But mature believers, people who have moved beyond milk, are now applying the gospel in their everyday life. I know a lot of really smart people. I try to surround myself with smart people because it makes me feel smarter. And I learn things. I learn from other people. And so I like to surround myself with smart people. But having intellectual knowledge and being smart doesn't necessarily make you mature. Right? I mean, how many of you know like really smart people that do really stupid things? Right? I mean, they're really, yeah, that wasn't a raise a hand thing, but I hopefully it's not the person next to you. So you just know people who are really, really smart, but say the dumbest things or act in a way that is so immature. And then there's people who are not that smart intellectually, like they probably wouldn't make a great trivia team member, but they're really mature. How they behave in public, they're socially mature. They act in such a way that is becoming of being a Christ follower. And And I find myself in that latter camp. Like I just was in a ton of meetings around some really smart people who knew really big words. And I am not saying that they're immature. I'm just saying, like, I didn't feel very intellectually smart in the room. I definitely didn't feel like the smartest person in the room. And yet, I think I can act in such a way that is becoming of a Christ follower. And how we interact with people, how we talk about other people, how we address situations and circumstances. It's not just about knowing the gospel. We have to begin applying the gospel into our everyday lives. And the more mature we are, the more peaceful we are. As I've grown in my faith and had a better understanding of the gospel's application into my everyday life, into my family, into my marriage, I have found much more peace in my life today than when I was younger. I don't think that that's just an age thing. Certainly some of that is. But I do think it's a spiritual maturity thing where some of the things that used to really, really bother me now seem trivial and insignificant. I just believe that the more we press in to our relationship with God, the more we allow Him to grow us, the more mature we become, the more peaceful people we are. And if we look into our culture and our society and we see a bunch of people who are yelling and screaming at each other and angry and causing strife and causing division, couldn't we just take a step back and say, like Paul, you guys are still drinking from milk. Like, you're not even ready for some meat yet. And so Paul holds this mirror up to this church and says, you guys are immature. And the obvious question then is, okay, well, if we're mature, then how do we grow? So Paul picks up in verse 5. He says, what, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? In my context, as I'm reading this, I'm hearing them sitting there listening to this letter. I know, okay, here we go. He's bringing up Apollos again. He's bringing up Paul. He says, only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. Paul says, I planted the seed. Like, I came in, I planted the church, I started the discipleship process, I sowed the seeds, I put them in. But then Apollos came along when I left, and he began to water it. He waters the seeds. He says something really, really important right here. He says, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything but only God, who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor, for we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field. You are God's building. One of the most obvious rites of passage as a child, if you've ever been around kids or you've seen kids in a playground setting or in a daycare or any of those circumstances, one of the inevitable rites of passage is for one kid, and it's usually a boy, to go up to another kid and look him straight in the eyes and say, my dad can beat up your dad. Have you ever heard this? Like, if it was my kid, if it was my son, and he was at the playground and he said to another kid, my dad can beat up your dad, I'd let that play out a little bit. Not because I think I could, because I probably can't, but just because he really believes that. He really believes that I could beat up that kid's dad. He's never seen that kid's dad. He doesn't know how big that kid's dad is. He doesn't know if that kid's dad's packing heat. Like, he doesn't know. But he believes that I could beat him up. And there's this argument that ensues. Oh, yeah? Well, my dad can beat up your dad. And it goes back and forth, and that is exactly what Paul is addressing with this church. They're sitting there saying, you know what? My pastor is better than your pastor. And they're standing over here saying, well, my pastor is better than your pastor. And they actually believe it. Now, obviously, your guys' pastor is better than the other church's pastors, and if we want to go into a fight, we can. But these guys are going back and forth, my pastor, and they're so emotional about it, and it's causing all of this strife and all of this division. And Paul is just simply saying, listen, you guys, stop it. I planted the seed. That's all I did. I just laid the foundation. And you accepted Christ, and Apollos came along. He's a great pastor. He's a great communicator. All he did was water those seeds. And he says, God is the only one that can make things grow. Now, here's what I would learn from that is that God uses leaders. He uses experiences to grow us. They're tools. They're Bible studies. They're pastors, their book studies. There's these things that God uses to grow us closer to Him in relationship to Him, but it doesn't mean that any of those things can take credit for it. Notice Paul doesn't minimize it. He doesn't say, I was just the guy who sowed the seeds and Apollos just kind of watered it. No, he acknowledges it. He says, yes, these things are important. These are a part of the process, and God uses us as His servants. But at the end of the day, it is God who causes you to grow, and only He gets the credit. I don't get to take credit for any sort of spiritual maturity or any form of spiritual growth. It is God's credit and God's credit alone. I was trying to think of an illustration of this. Like, what does that look like in the practicality of life and today? And I had an interesting interaction and experience just a few weeks ago while I was in Colombia. I don't know if I shared this with you or not. I probably did. It's been a few weeks. But we were on our way to the hospital boat, and we had picked up an indigenous pastor named Pastor Acho. And Pastor Acho gets on the speedboat, because we're taking the speedboat to the hospital boat, and Juan Allen, my good friend Juan Allen, introduces me to Pastor Acho, and he says, Pastor Acho, this is Pastor Ryan, my friend, and he pastors Lifehouse. And Pastor Acho's response was this. He says, Lifehouse? The water tanks? It wasn't, oh, Pastor Ryan, it is so good to meet you. You must be an amazing, amazing teacher. No, it was the water tanks? You're a part of that church? See, I don't get to take credit for the water tanks. And clearly, Pastor Acho was not going to give me credit for the water tanks. He was giving credit to who? To the church, to God for bringing a church that would be so generous to buy water tanks, to give to villages, to make a difference in the Amazon region. And I don't get to take credit for that. In all of these meetings, that you have all these pastors that I was in this last week, you have pastors are just kind of notorious for this about like, how's your church doing? And what they really want to know is, how big is your church? Like, is it, what'd you bring in? What'd you bring in this last month? They would never say that. But it's always couching, how's your church doing? You guys making it okay? You guys doing all right? And there's this kind of mentality as though it's my church. And I always correct it. I'm like, it's not my church. I can get hit by a bus tomorrow. And this church continues to go on. It continues to grow. It continues to buy water tanks for the Amazon region. It continues to fund roofs. It continues to live on mission in your life circle. It has nothing to do with me. I'm just a servant who has agreed to the calling for this season of my life and said, okay, God, I will teach. I will do what I can to lead people. But at the end of the day, you have to grow these people. But here is what we can do. We can provide opportunities for growth. Whether that's through coming up with the discipleship journey that we're we're testing in this process of creating opportunities to equip you and to help you both on online classes or in-person classes where you're being equipped, you're gaining more knowledge and information about what it means to be a Christ follower. And so there's like these opportunities for you to participate in. We can create opportunities in our homes. Right? There's one thing that I had to come to terms with, and it's that I can't force my kids to love and follow Jesus, and neither can you. But we can create opportunities, and we can sow as many seeds as possible, and not just sit on our hands while the world disciples my kids. See, I can't make them follow Jesus. We had two goals. As parents, when we had kids, we were in the ministry and we said, we just want our kids, and this is how we pray and how we try to live. We want our kids to love Jesus first and foremost, and then to love his church. Because if you're not aware, pastors' kids are notorious for not loving the church. They spend way too much time there. They're kind of pigeonholed into being this stand-up person and all of that. Luckily, I had parents who never put that pressure on me, and that was in a small town. They never pressured me to be anything other than who I was, and so I loved the church. I loved Jesus, and we wanted that for our kids. But we knew in our hearts that there was nothing we could do to force them to love Jesus in the church. And so we could just create environments and sow as many seeds as possible into their life, create opportunities for them to experience a healthy environment, a healthy church in such a way that we just say, okay, God, now you're going to have to grow them. You're going to have to grow them. So we create these environments, and then we learn from other leaders, from faithful leaders. This is something we're going to talk about more as we get into the year, but we're going to be focusing more time and energy on defining and challenging our church in the area of discipleship. This idea that we could be pouring into other people and having other people who are maybe 2 steps ahead of us pouring into us. And so answering the questions, who am I pouring into and who's pouring into me? And part of the reason is, Kelly and I decided that we would do youth. We would participate in leading our youth because we saw this challenge that we were facing, really a crisis that we were facing where our young people were walking further and further away from the Lord, and they weren't loving Jesus and they weren't loving the church. And so we were like, what can we do to be a part of that solution? And I just think, I just heard a message on this recently where the tagline of the message was, we don't have a next-gen problem, we have a discipleship problem. And it really resonated with my heart because I think it's easy for us, especially as I get older, it's easy for me to look to younger generations. I mean, we have millennials in our church, we have Gen Z. Marley, what are you guys? You guys Gen A? I think. Gen Z, and then the next generation, I think is called Gen A. We're just starting the alphabet over, I guess. But, and it's easy for us to look at the next generations and say we've got a generational problem. These kids, they don't love Jesus, they don't work hard, and we put all of these stereotypes on them. And I just thought, as someone who has been guilty of making fun of other generations. Like even just on a Sunday morning as a Gen Xer, I was kind of making fun of all generations except for mine because we're the best generation. And not the greatest, just the best. But I was really challenged by this message because I realized we shouldn't be mocking any generation. Nobody wants to engage in conversation with people who are mocking them. Nobody wants to be friends with people who are saying, as a millennial, a stereotype is, well, you guys don't work hard. Well, nobody wants to be friends with people who think they don't work hard. And it doesn't matter what cultural dynamics are there. What if we were to just take a step back and say, we're not going to mock the next generations or the generations that went before us and didn't do what we think that they should have done, or those generations that are lower than us and younger than us that aren't doing what we think that they should do, and we just take a step back and say, we're going to be about discipleship. We're just going to love people, and we're going to look for opportunities to disciple people, because we don't have a generation problem, we have a discipleship problem. And if I could just speak freely, I think I already am, but as the church goes in the U.S., I really believe that the discipleship component, because friends, this isn't discipleship. This is a form of discipleship, but it's an ineffective form of discipleship. I can teach you, I can equip you, and you can go out into the world, but the question is what are we going out to? Who are we discipling? Who are we pouring into? You say, well, I'm not qualified to do that. Find somebody who will pour into you. And then there's always somebody who's just 2 steps behind. We're going to get into more of that. I already talked too long about it. 1 Thessalonians 2:8 says, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And that's really what I'm talking about in discipleship. I'm not talking about taking somebody through a book or sitting down and journaling together. Not bad things, good things, but I'm talking about what does it look like to do life together. The third thing is that we can trust God with the results. Again, I already mentioned this, but we just have to be at peace with the fact that at the end of the day, it's God who's going to grow his people, not us. And isn't that kind of freeing? Like, to know that it's not incumbent upon me to grow someone? That's the Holy Spirit's job. That's God's job to do in someone else. My job is just to be obedient to the things he's called me to do. And his very last words, by the way, were to go and make disciples, and so maybe that ought to be our priority. Verse 10, by the grace God has given me, and I'm going to land the plane here, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is. Because the day, and that is in reference to judgment, like there's going to be a time where we're all standing at Judgment Day, it will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss. It's an interesting point here, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Paul's making this distinction here that at Judgment Day, there is going to be this moment where we're going to stand before him and we're going to have to give an account. Certainly, we all have to give an account to our salvation, to the foundation that's been laid. But we also have to give an account to what we built upon that foundation. And what Paul is indicating here is there will be some people who, when they stand and give an account for the structure that was built, the life that was built on that foundation, and if it is burned away, they still experience salvation and they experience escaping the flames. They experience escaping hell, but there is no reward. I find that interesting. Have anybody ever seen a structure, a house, or something that's been burned down, or a tornado's come through, or hurricanes come through, and what happens inevitably? The whole structure is completely destroyed. And what is left? The foundation. The foundation is still intact, and you can then go ahead and build back onto that foundation, and hopefully you build it in such a way that it will withstand whatever storms come that way. But it's this picture, and I like the picture of what's going to happen at Judgment Day, where we stand before the Lord, and it's not that our salvation is in question. It's not the foundation that's the problem. It's the fact that we have spent all of our life building something that is just going to be coming into rubble, and the only thing that will be left is our salvation. It's interesting. And so my question, and I leave you with this morning, is, what are you building? What kind of structure are you building on the foundation of your salvation? And this follow-up question to that is, will it last? Because Paul uses all of these construction material language. We read the precious stone there, or costly stones, and we think diamonds and rubies, and that's what I think of. But really, he's talking about limestone and granite and stones that would have been used to withstand in the construction. And my question for you and for me this morning is, what is it that we are building on that foundation in our lives? What are we pursuing? What's the framework for your life? Is it just that you're saved and you can go and live your life however you want to live it and pursue things that will just burn up like straw and have nothing to show with it in the end? Or are you pursuing eternal things? Are you pursuing kingdom things? Are you building your life around the things that have eternal significance and that matter? That's the challenge for us, right? It's easier said than done, and it's certainly something that we have to wrestle with every day of our life. But my hope is that as we allow God to grow us, it will begin to grow in such a way that we move from spiritual immaturity to spiritual maturity, and we begin building on this foundation, the salvation of Christ, that we begin to start seeing eternal significance take place in our life. Let's pray.